I'd like to welcome everybody tonight to this presentation. It's on the 8th of August, and we have two amazing presenters who are going to speak about some aspects of the Baha'i community in the state of Victoria. Thanks for coming online from all around Australia. I see people from most states as well as from New Zealand and maybe other countries as well, but we're in for a treat. I'll introduce both the speakers at the beginning. Our first speaker is Jane McLachlan. Now, Jane was born in Canberra but raised in Melbourne, where her family's origins go back to the 1850s. She became a Baha'i in 1973, shortly after graduating in arts with a major in economics from the Melbourne University. She's worked in teaching, administration and research, and has raised two daughters, Emily and Alice. Later in life, Jane returned to studies. In 2006, she completed an honours in Australian history at Melbourne University, and she focused on race relations and wrote a thesis on the 1967 referendum. She served on 4 local assemblies across 4 decades, currently with the Baha'is Assembly. She served also on state and national committees. In 2009, she coordinated the Baha'i community's participation in the Melbourne Parliament of the World's Religions, and she currently serves as an external affairs representative for the Australian Baha'i community in Victoria. Now, our second speaker is Terry Eickler. Now, Terry grew up and was educated in Portland in Victoria. He majored in modern and British history during his high school years. And in 1967, his studies at Monash were interrupted by conscription and military service during the Vietnam War. After the war, he completed a diploma in teaching, and he taught in Victorian schools for some 2 decades. Terry and his wife, Kim, became Baha'is in 1973, which is the same year as Jane, actually, after moving to Geelong. They were members of the first local spiritual assembly of Geelong West and members of the National Vietnamese Teaching Committee in the 1980s and 1990s. Terry also went back to further studies. In the 1990s, he obtained a Bachelor of Arts with honours in painting at the Victorian College of the Arts, Melbourne University. And shortly after that, 2003, he completed a Master of Fine Arts at RMIT University. He's served on the Greater Geelong Assembly for a number of years, and he's been its archivist since 2006. He's working on a biography of Geelong pioneer Emily Miller-Easy. So there are 2 wonderful speakers for tonight. I'd like to welcome you both, and I'd like to hand over to Jane to share her screen and to begin your presentation.
Thank you, Graham. I'll just do what I did before to get the screen up. Right, can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. What a relief. I'd like to thank Graham especially for this invitation to present tonight. And it's lovely to see so many of you here. I know that we've got quite a bit of competition tonight. I was a bit surprised when Graham approached me because I haven't really looked at much Baha'i history for the last 30 years. Except for a little bit of local history in my community of Banyul. But 30 years ago, or a little bit more than that, I was originally inspired to look into the history of the early Victorian believers by a visit to the Hassel home in Sydney around 1983, I think it was. And Graham subsequently sent me a list of names of early Melbourne Baha'is and explained that almost nothing was known about any of them, with the exception of Effie Baker. So I was quite intrigued to pursue this, and tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of them, Margaret Dixson, but I also want to explain the processes that I followed and explore how this history can be used to benefit the Baha'i community today and in the future. I just want to let you all know who it is we are talking about tonight. So if I'm able to do this, oh, what do you know? So excited, I've just learned how to do this. That's Margaret Dixson sitting next to Martha Root during Martha Root's visit to Melbourne in 1924. This is a very famous photograph. You'll find that this is in our centenary booklet that's been published. It's on the centenary website. It's in the biography of Martha Root, and you'll see it many other places on the internet. Not always with the right identification, but this is definitely Melbourne in 1924. Margaret Dixon is sitting next to Martha Root. She actually formed a very close relationship with Martha. So why did I settle on looking into Margaret Dixon? Because there were at least 20 to 25 names on the list that I originally got from Graham. First of all, I wanted to look at someone whose involvement with the faith had endured over time. A lot of people joined the faith, but they drifted away. You never heard of them again. Margaret joined in 1923 and she stayed with it. She was faithful and devoted until her passing in 1940. So in the records that exist of the time, her name would keep coming up again and again. And there were others, but she was the one I chose to focus on. Secondly, Graham provided me with a fascinating document called The Diary of a Melbourne Baha'i, which is in the National Archives and covers most of the period 1934 to 1940. This is a remarkable document. It goes into great detail about the Baha'i activities in Melbourne. It also describes the very first national convention where our first National Spiritual Assembly was elected. Thirdly, I knew that Margaret had had children at the time that she became a Baha'i, unlike many others who became Baha'is in later life and their children were already grown. But two of Margaret's children actually accompanied her to a lot of Baha'i activities. So I thought there could be descendants that I could talk to. And lastly, her name, with its unusual spelling, the S in Dixon, meant that I might have a good chance of actually finding them. So remember that this was all in the days before the internet. This was back in 1987. And as is often the case, I needed a bit of a deadline to get moving, and the deadline was a Baha'i Studies Conference held at Baha'i House in September 1987. So that gave me a bit of a push along to do some work, and I presented a paper there on the early history of the faith in Melbourne, and Graham presented one on the Duns and the early Victorian Bahais. So in preparation for this little Baha'i Studies Conference, I followed through with my hunches and I looked up the phone book for the Dixons in it. I knew that Margaret had had a son, Jack, and on my first phone call, I found myself talking with her grandson, with whom Jack was still living. Grandson, John David, then gave me contacts for other family members, including Margaret's daughter Molly, her granddaughter Miriam, and I was on my way. Now, I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail about Margaret's background and what she did for the faith, because there are a couple of articles online which cover this in some depth, and I will come back to those and refer to them later. But to give you a little thumbnail sketch, Margaret Shann, she was, as her maiden name, was born in 1877 to parents Frank Shann and Frances Wood, who were of English and Irish Protestant origins. They belonged to the Church of England. Frank worked for a time as a country newspaper editor and a teacher, and was a deeply religious man, even into his later life. But very unusually for that time, these parents divorced sometime in the 1880s, so the children were still relatively young. The two sons went with their father, and subsequently became upwardly mobile, prosperous, and very well known. One of them, Edward Owen Giblin Shann, became a prominent economic historian and professor of economic history at the University of Western Australia, while the other one, Frank, became the headmaster of Trinity Grammar in Kew, Melbourne. The two daughters, however, stayed with their mother and sank into poverty and obscurity. Nevertheless, Margaret had had a moderately good education for a girl of those days and went to work as a governess on a farm in northeastern Victoria. There, in around 1898, aged 21 years, she married her employer's brother, the handsome Walter Dixson, who was some 16 years her senior. Walter was a successful wheat farmer near Numurkah. Even on the farm, Margaret was interested in things like numerology and astrology, and began studying Esperanto with its implications for world unity. She loved books, played the piano, and organised musical evenings at her home. However, her ability to pursue her passions was greatly curtailed by the hard work that life on the farm entailed. Her first pregnancy ended tragically with twins who died shortly after birth. But she subsequently had 3 more children, Doris, Jack, and Molly. Molly was 9 years younger than her brother. Tragedy struck again in 1916 when Walter, struggling to harvest the crop without help during the war years, died of a cerebral hemorrhage while Margaret was pregnant with Molly. In due course, Margaret and her children left the farm and returned to Melbourne, where she settled at Pascoe Vale. Her return to the city enabled her to better pursue her interests in matters of the spirit and mind. 1923 found her teaching numerology classes at the New Civilization Centre, and we've learned in previous sessions about the Hyde Dunn and Clara and how they would seek out receptive groups of people that would invite them to speak from their platforms, and the New Civilization Centre was one in Melbourne. Hyde Dunn was giving talks about the faith, and a number of the early Baha'is encountered it there. Margaret heard of the faith in 1923, November, and declared herself a Baha'i. Here she is at the very far left of this group in the photo, and the little girl in front of Clara Dunn is Molly. Margaret became very close to the Dunns, and I wonder if the shared experience that she and Clara had had of being suddenly widowed at a very young age with a child to support, this created a special bond between them. In November 1925, she moved to Sydney to be with the Dunns and care for Clara, who was ill. With Jack and Molly, she lived with the Dunns at Randwick, and the Dunns paid for Molly to attend a Catholic school there. Margaret stayed in Sydney for a couple of years and later also visited the Dunns in Adelaide and Brisbane, but in the late 20s returned to Melbourne. She often suffered from ill health and money was always tight. She found whatever kind of work she could: housekeeping, scrubbing bank offices, working as a caretaker at Kilvington Girls' School, selling tickets at Luna Park, teaching classes in Esperanto in a tram at the back of a house, and setting up a nursery school for young children. She moved many, many times, wherever the work would take her. She served the infant Baha'i cause in numerous ways, supporting the Dunns, serving as an assembly secretary, writing press releases for Martha Root's visit, arranging opportunities for Martha and also Keith Ransom Kaler to speak when she also visited Melbourne, writing articles for Herald of the South, teaching seekers whenever she had the opportunity, and importantly, keeping diaries, recording Baha'i activities, which she hoped would someday be of historical value. The early Melbourne assemblies that were formed in the 20s didn't endure into the 30s, so there were no Melbourne delegates to the first National Convention. However, 2 Melbourne Bahais attended. Margaret Dixson, again, she's at the very, very far left of this photo, sitting in the front row, and Emily Miller, about whom Terry is going to speak later on tonight. It was a struggle to get there. I think Margaret travelled 3rd class to be present. As it so happened, Margaret's granddaughter, Miriam Dixson, turned out to be a recognised Australian historian working at the University of New England in Armidale. She wrote to me as follows: "As her eldest grandchild, I adored her and was heartbroken when she died. I was then 9 years old. I have no doubt that she was the greatest single influence on my life, and I believe I owe to her what has proved an absolutely life-sustained passion for the world of the mind." Building upon the connection that we had made with Miriam Dixson, a Baha'i Studies conference was held at La Trobe University in 1988, at which Miriam provided a paper about her grandmother's background, and Graham presented a paper about Margaret and other women's contribution to the early development of the faith in Australia. These papers can be accessed online, so I draw your attention to those papers there. If you go to the Baha'i Library online, you can find both of those papers. If you just Google Margaret Dixson, remember with the S, you will find them. I also just want to draw your attention to the program. We had John Gray play piano for us. Margaret was a very good pianist. And then we had selections from the hidden words in English and Esperanto as a tribute to Margaret's interest and competence in Esperanto. And then we had these 2 papers, one by Miriam Dixson and one by Graham. Molly, Margaret's daughter, and her daughter and grandson were present on that evening. Now, my contact with the family had revealed that Margaret had been buried at Springvale Cemetery, but that the grave was unmarked. Inspired by her story, the local spiritual assembly of Springvale set about raising funds for a befitting headstone. By late 1989, it was ready, and a memorial service was held to mark that occasion. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of Bill and Agnes Keane in bringing all of that about. I think they're with us this evening. Her descendants were also invited to attend this memorial service, and quite a number of them did. Margaret's headstone is in the Church of England section of the Springvale Cemetery. It's a family plot that also holds her father. The headstone reads, "Margaret Bertha Dixson, née Shann, founding member of the Baha'i faith in Victoria, erected in loving memory by the Victorian Bahai community, 1989. And in the middle is a quote from Abdul Baha, "Behold a candle, how it gives its light. It weeps its life away drop by drop in order to give forth its flame of light." That was chosen because Margaret chose that quotation to preface her diary. But reading it, I always felt it rather reflected her own life as well. In 2013, I had occasion to visit the Springvale Botanical Cemetery to run a training session for their staff on Baha'i funeral requirements. The cemetery is a very popular one in the Baha'i community. There are many Baha'i graves there. It's also an award-winning cemetery for its beauty and its community engagement initiatives. At that training session, I met the historian of the cemetery, Dr. Celestina Sagazio, who wanted to show me a rather grand Baha'i grave. So we went there, and then I asked to visit Margaret's grave with her. She asked me to send her some details of Margaret's story, and subsequently she included the grave in her multi-faith tours of Springvale Cemetery as a significant Baha'i grave. The headstone was dedicated in the presence of a number of the Victorian friends and some of Margaret's descendants. It was adorned with a beautiful floral arrangement which Anissa Cumberbatch had put together. Here's a picture of Margaret's descendants at the grave. That's Molly, her daughter, in the grey dress. At the far right, Miriam Dixson, her granddaughter. In the front next to Miriam is her daughter, Susan Rector. Behind her are her two sisters, Miriam's two sisters, a couple of Baha'is, including Bill Johnson in the back row. And behind Molly's right shoulder is her daughter, Susan, and her grandson, Remy. You know, coming back to this after 30 years, I really had some misgivings, and I thought, you know, what did we do? Did we do the right thing? Sometimes when you're dealing with families, you're dealing with their loved ones, you really wonder, in retrospect, did you do the right things? Did you say the right things? Did you make them feel comfortable? One of the young members of the greater Dandenong community found these pictures in the archives for me, Daniel Talwala. I'm very grateful to Daniel for doing that. But when I saw them, it gave me some degree of reassurance, because I do think that everybody was very happy by the occasion. Earlier this year, it suddenly occurred to me, being the centenary year, this would be a good opportunity to remember a little bit of our Baha'i history and make sure that the new generation is aware of it, because 30 years is more than a generation and many people are not aware of it. So I contacted the Spiritual Assembly of Greater Dandenong and pointed out that on the 25th of June, it would be the 80th anniversary of Margaret's passing. And bless them, they picked up this idea and they held a small graveside memorial service for her with these beautiful flowers. They got the picture, they've got a candle there, and they did mark this occasion. And indeed, it was very inspirational to the younger members of the community, because they had known nothing about this story. Here's the group of them who were gathered because of restrictions, gathering restrictions. We could only have 10 people there. I wasn't able to be present, but that was good because somebody else who'd never been was able to go. So there were 10 people, including the cameraman, I think, and they also took a video of the occasion. And I only saw that video yesterday, and it is very moving and very beautiful. And I really do congratulate them for what they have achieved. I want to go back a little bit to the family members. This is Molly and the family at the grave. Molly in the full-length dress with the pearls there. One of the really significant outcomes of contacting Molly was that she was still in possession of another one of Margaret's diaries. And although it was much briefer than the one held in the archives, it nevertheless sheds light on the activities of the community in the period 1937 to 1940, giving names, addresses, and other details of the Baha'is' lives and their activities. One of the things that I was very interested to know about was the way that the children of the early believers had felt about the faith and their parents' commitment to it, as very few of them became Baha'is themselves. There was very, very little carryover from the original generation into a second or third generation in Melbourne. And I remember going to a summer school camp at Yarra, and Jim Heggie was speaking many, many years ago, and he made a similar observation about the Baha'i communities in other states, although I do believe that Sydney and especially Adelaide had a lot more carryover than we did in Melbourne. We had practically none. So I was interested to know why this was and what did these people feel. At the time that Margaret joined the faith, her first daughter Doris was 20 and already independent. So she really had left home by that stage. Jack was a teenager of 16. Molly was only 7. But if you can imagine, she was probably the only child in the Baha'i community at that time. Molly shared the following recollections with me. Clara was a handsome woman with a vibrant personality. Father Dunn wore a bow tie with polka dots. We were a little intolerant of Mum and wished that she belonged to a religion the same as other people's. I was always aware of the fact that my mother was not made of common clay. Jack thought Mum was divorced from reality and could not accept her idealism. He went his own way politically. And granddaughter Miriam confirmed that Jack was an atheist and left-wing. I think you can imagine it would have been very lonely, not only for the Baha'is, but also for their children. Imagine it's probably, I mean, I was thinking we've got it very easy, you know, today in multi-faith, multicultural Australia with so many different religious faiths, and yet it can still be challenging. So imagine back in those days when everybody was Catholic or Church of England or Presbyterian, one of the major Christian denominations, how difficult it would have been to explain what your mother's religion was. Grandson John David Dixson said that Margaret had all the grandchildren christened as Baha'is, but we are only nominal Baha'is. Margaret was into spiritual things and the afterlife. Jack used to go along to Baha'i meetings just to keep Mum company. I didn't speak directly to Jack. He was in the background, but saying things which John then relayed. And he was able to remember the names of half a dozen early Baha'is, including the Dunns, and said they were good people. Jack passed away less than a year after that conversation. In spite of their differences of views, Margaret remained close to her children until the end of her life, and they visited and corresponded with her regularly. Upon her passing, the death notice they submitted to the Argus, after listing all the family's names, added, "A great soul has passed." They also had the Unitarian minister, Reverend Bottomley, who had welcomed Martha Root, conduct her funeral service. Following that evening that was held at La Trobe University, the evening in honour of Margaret Dixon in 1988, Molly sent me a card and I'd like to share some of it with you. She said, "Thank you for a profoundly moving tribute to my mother. When the boy was repeating the Baha'i sayings in Esperanto, it was as though I was a little girl again, listening to Mum saying prayers in Esperanto. To me, my mother had a hard, sad life. But in retrospect, her total involvement in the Baha'i movement gave her great joy and fulfillment." So I thought, well, if what we did provided Molly with some happiness and comfort in regard to her mother's Baha'i commitment, then it was definitely worth doing. Now, I'm going to digress for a couple of minutes from Margaret to a couple of other things that I've been looking into in the last couple of weeks. I had loved this photo. It's a really iconic photo of the early Melbourne Baha'is with the Dunns. And I've always wondered what its significance was. Where was it taken? When was it taken? And why? 15 years ago, sorry, what am I saying? 30 years ago, another thing that I did was drive around South Yarra and the CBD, with a list of addresses that were mentioned in Margaret's diaries and other documents in the archives, following up on some of the addresses where Baha'i meetings had been held. And I took a bunch of slides, and then they were tucked away in a cupboard, and I didn't know if I'd be able to find them. I've got an entire cupboard full of, you know, packages of photographs and packets of slides and plastic bags. I pulled out a plastic bag, I put my hand into the bag, I pulled out a packet of slides, and guess what? The first packet I put my hand on was the packet of these slides. And the one that I was most excited about was this one. This is 428 Punt Road, South Yarra. And if you look at, let me see if I can get this pen to actually work. No. I know I can do this. There we go. If you look at this, you look at the brickwork. And you look at the pattern in the iron lace, and you look at this detail on the arches, and then you go back to this photo, you will see that it's all there. So there is no doubt in my mind that that is 428 Punt Road. A lot of Baha'i activities were held there. It became quite a centre, being the home of Eleanor and Harold Wheeler. This picture was taken in 1987, as I said. I think I was concerned that some of these buildings would be demolished, and if I didn't get pictures of them, we might never be able to identify them. This is a picture of the same property from the street, and as you can see, it was in a state of considerable disrepair. In the end, it wasn't demolished, but it was purchased, and the new owners built a very high brick fence, knocked off the chimneys, put a second story on here, so it's almost unrecognisable, and it would not be possible to get a photograph like that today. So I was pleased that I had taken it. I'm not sure yet what the occasion was for this photograph being taken. I've been sending Graham emails, and he's so busy with a million projects in the pipeline, but we are gradually making some progress, I think. This was another one taken possibly 23, possibly 24. And again, looking at the structure of this building is very interesting to me, because I'll just highlight a couple of things for you. Okay, have a look at these windows. The fact that there's 4 panes in the windows. Have a look at this wall here. Have a look at this, right? You've got to bear in mind that, you know, a lot of time has passed and fashions come and go tremendously, and people will do amazing things to houses. But there is a possibility it might be this one, which is 82 Leopold, South Yarra. This was a home where the Dunns stayed, where they sent correspondence from, and it was another address which is mentioned very much in the archival materials. So we're looking into that, and many strange coincidences have happened, I must say, in these last few weeks, but one of them has turned out to be that the current owners of this property, 82 Leopold Street, are very, very long-standing friends of Felicity Ronalden, a Melbourne Baha'i who has been attending this series, and she's online tonight. So we might be able to chat to her a little bit later. So just going back to Margaret before I wrap up, I haven't said a great deal about her contribution, but I think it's fitting to perhaps end on this note. There are a couple of things that I'd like to share. Clearly, Martha Root had developed a very good relationship with Margaret, because in her diary, Margaret writes the following: "Martha showered such tender love upon me that I was indeed strengthened and refreshed by the meeting, and on parting gave to my unworthy self a sacred relic, a hair from the head of our glorious Lord, the last one she had left. It will always be my most treasured possession, and my humble prayer is that I will become more worthy to be the recipient of such treasure." And in the memoriam section of Baha'i World was a little tribute by another early believer, Eleanor Wheeler. And she said, "The passing of Mrs. Margaret Dixson recalls the early days of the Baha'i cause in Melbourne. Mrs. Dixon was one of the first to accept the teachings brought to Australia by Mr. and Mrs. Hyde Dunn. By her pen and voice, in season and out of season, she strove to spread the Baha'i teachings wherever she went, and even when stricken with illness, she carried on the work with unabated enthusiasm." She passed away in 1940, having had heart attacks, strokes, kidney disease, but I thought this was a lovely tribute by Eleanor Wheeler to the work that she had done for the cause. No doubt, had she had greater means, better health, there are other things that she really wanted to accomplish that she wasn't able to. She was supposed to have gone on pilgrimage with Clara Dunn. That didn't happen. She wanted to go travel teaching. That didn't happen either. But given the limitations that she faced, she did the most that she could. So I think I'll wrap up there, Graham, and stop my screen share. Thank you. I stopped.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was a splendid presentation, very moving, a tribute not only to Margaret Dixon, but to your work over 3 decades and more to find out all that you can about not only Margaret's, but some of the other early Baha'is. And I think that there are some questions that have been raised in the comments section. And so what I'd like to ask everybody is if we can just have 2 or 3 questions that are specifically focused on Jane's presentation before we move to Terry's presentation. So can I invite, if you have a specific question, or Jane, if you can see the comments there. One was, in that photo, 1924 photo with Martha Root, do we know who the other people were?
I'm afraid that I don't know. I would love to know. Some of them appear in the other picture in front of the house at 428 Punt Road. And I don't know. I don't know what Ruby Beaver looks like. I can see a question there. There's a question there. I wonder if she learnt about the Baha'i faith when learning Esperanto. As far as I understand from the paper by her granddaughter Miriam, she was already learning Esperanto up in northeastern Victoria before she came to Melbourne and met the Dunns. Okay, are there any other questions? They're mostly comments.
There's the question from Siva.
Oh, yes. Why the funeral? The funeral service was held at the funeral directors, and it was very, very brief. They had only really allowed 15 minutes for the funeral service. If you can imagine, you know, the understanding was very rudimentary in many respects back in those days, and there was no assembly in Melbourne. There was just maybe half a dozen active Baha'is. So I think there was still a certain amount of mixing between the old religion and the new religion, and they weren't as organised as we are today. But the Reverend Bottomley was a very sympathetic minister coming from the Unitarian Church. He had welcomed Martha Root to his church. So she and they and her family probably felt that he was the most appropriate person.
Thank you, Jane. So perhaps I'll just get a chance for one more person to ask a question about, and we have one there from Mirzad.
Oh, yes. Molly was very gracious in lending me that other smaller diary, and I had to give it back to her. Now, Molly passed away about 10 years after we were in contact. I'm in the process of trying to track down her daughter in the hope that I might be able to find that diary and get it into the archives. I have made contact with her granddaughter, Miriam Dixson. She's now living in Melbourne, Graham, as I thought she might be. And I have spoken to both her and her daughter, Susan Rector, and conveyed the fact that if there are any things that they no longer have a need of, we would love to have them in the archives, but if they still want to hold on to them, they can be scanned and forwarded. And I'm hoping that we may get some more materials through that.
Thank you, Jane. There's one more question there from Siva again about whether there are any Baha'i descendants.
No. There were only 3 children, and as I explained, the eldest one, Doris, was already grown. I don't think she ever married. Then there was Jack. He had 4 children. None of them were Baha'is. And there was Molly, who had 1 child, and she was not a Baha'i. Because Molly and Jack themselves, when they grew up and their mother passed away, they did not consider themselves to be Baha'is. If you can imagine, back at that time, there were many, many different spiritualist type movements. So this is what I find really remarkable about the early Baha'is, especially the ones who joined and stayed. How did they achieve that recognition? Because there were many different movements. So, you would have to be a very, very confident person to say, well, I think that this is the one that's right. I remember having similar feelings when I was looking into the faith in the early 70s. I thought it was another Indian sect. There were plenty around at the time. Remember the Orange people? Whoever hears about the Orange people today? I thought it was just another one. So how is it that some people achieve this recognition, but others do not? So there aren't any Baha'i descendants, but they are very friendly towards the faith. And this is one of the joys that I found going through this process, was to find that although they may not be Baha'is, they are our well-wishers. And there must be many, many, many people out there in that category.
Okay, one final question from Ahmed.
Yes, she did serve I think she served on the Sydney Assembly and then later on the Melbourne Assembly. I think, Graham, does that gel with?
I would have put it the other way around, that she was on the first Melbourne Assembly until it faltered. And then when she went to Sydney about 1925, 26, 27,
yeah,
she was on the Sydney Assembly. But when she went back to Melbourne, there was no assembly.
No assembly.
She passed in 40, and we learned, I think just last week or the week before, that the Melbourne Assembly was re-established in 1948. Does everybody remember?
Yeah.
Jane, thank you so much. I didn't know whether you wanted to introduce into the conversation anybody else at this stage, or leave that for after.
We might leave that for after Terry's presentation.
Thank you so much, Jane. That's just amazing, and the comments are so supportive and giving so much praise for the session that you've given. I know it's silent in that sense that you're not getting applause, but there are some hands visible on the screen and there's comments. Now we will come back to Jane later after Terry's presentation. There'll be time for more questions in an open session. So thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you.
So I want to once again introduce Terry Eickler. I introduced Terry at the beginning. He has been part of the Geelong Baha'i community since the 1970s, he and his wife Kim. Terry and I have been in occasional contact for easily 2 decades and more, and he has diligently searched out the history of his community, and I'm especially looking forward tonight to hearing Terry. So Terry, welcome. We look forward to your presentation.
Hello, Graham. Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Share screen.
It's not up yet, Terry.
Okay, and play. Thank you. Can you see that?
Yes,
Can you see that, Graham?
we can see it. Yes, you're ready.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Graham. It's such a privilege to be involved in this session tonight. I've been, I think, to pretty well every session so far, perhaps one, but I caught up with that later on. And they're just wonderful. It's a wonderful thing that we're looking at the history. And I really appreciate it, and I thank you for the invitation. Before I begin, could I just say that I was born on Gundit Chamara country at Portland, and now I live on Wadawurrung country in Geelong. And I'd like to pay my respects to all the Wadawurrung elders, past, present and emerging. But I also mentioned that there may be images and names of deceased persons in this presentation. My presentation begins with Emily Easy, who I met in 1973 in Geelong when I first became a Baha'i. I was introduced to the faith by Warren Hastings, who was at the Teachers College when I went there when I came back from Vietnam. And he introduced me to this elderly lady. She was 83 at the time, and she had a particular presence that you couldn't mistake, a statue that I've never forgotten. And so my presentation tonight will begin with Emily Easy, and it won't go right throughout her whole life, but also branch into some of the other history and some of the other personalities that I've come across during my Baha'i life. So this is Emily Miller Easy. She was Emily Miller. She was born Emily Miller, and later on became Mrs. Easy, and she was well known in the Baha'i community of later decades as Emily Easy. She was one of the earliest Australians to accept the faith of Baha'u'llah after meeting Mother Dunn in Sydney, I think, and also at that meeting was Margaret Dixson. So their lives were in sort of parallel for the next few decades. And she declared her belief in the faith in 1926. I think this photo was probably taken about in the 1940s. Emily was the daughter of Robert and Isabella Miller. Both her paternal and maternal ancestors came from Scotland. On her father's side, Emily was descended from farmers in Fifeshire, Scotland. On her mother's side, from a line of sea captains originally from Glasgow and Aberdeen. Some of these seafaring ancestors are buried at Queenscliff in Victoria. So she came from really remarkably adventurous stock. Emily's father, Robert, was a mounted policeman, first in Victoria and then in Queensland. He was such a skilled horseman that he was employed as the riding master at the Royal Court in Siam, Thailand, instructing the royal children and working with the cavalry. Emily was born after her parents returned to Australia from that.
Yeah, I put it, I think, on that big.
Sorry? Is that
Please
okay?
proceed.
Yeah. This is Emily's father, mounted constable Robert Miller, in Gladstone in the 1890s. Emily was born in Gladstone, Queensland in 1890. In 1892, Emily's family moved south to Melbourne, just as a severe economic shock plunged the nation into a depression. Melbourne was particularly affected. Thousands lost their jobs and homes and had to defend for themselves on the street. the Miller family pawned all their possessions to stave off hunger and set out for Gippsland to find work and a place to live. At the same time, waves of influenza swept through the population, causing widespread suffering. So in this COVID year, we can see that these things have happened before. The family eventually arrived in Ballara on the edge of what was then known as the Great Forest of Southern Gippsland. The family found a timbered block with a creek running through it on the outskirts of the town and began clearing it by hand. They worked hard for 14 years and turned it into a productive dairy farm. This is a school that Emily attended in the 1900s when she went to school. It was a good school, and I think probably Emily is in that picture because that's Mr. Bell, who standing up the back, who was the head teacher at that stage. The early life of Emily is very, very interesting. It's quintessentially Australian in terms of the struggle that the family had to eke out a living and clearing their block of forest. And one of the things with the forest there was that as farmers cleared the land, the forest dried out, and there were these enormous bushfires, and their property was swept by bushfires on 2 occasions. So it's very relatable in terms of Australian history. This is a painting in the National Gallery in Victoria of one of those bushfires in Gippsland. In 1906, the Millers sold their farm at Ballara and moved to Port Albert on the coast. We know very little about Emily's life at Port Albert. She was then 16 years old, and like other young people from working class backgrounds, would have been expected to find a job to support herself and help her family. Higher education would have been ruled out by the family's financial situation. In any case, a state school education was regarded as sufficient schooling for the vast majority of people. Although there was little chance of higher education for Emily or her siblings, Emily seems to have had a great thirst for knowledge. Muriel Handley, who actually after Emily passed away, was asked to write a brief history of Emily for the Universal House of Justice, and that was in the National Archives, National Bahai Archives, and Margaret Dixson found it. And so a lot of the research that I've been looking at in terms of Emily's life is based on that history that Muriel Handley wrote. Muriel, you'll hear a little bit about Muriel a little bit later on. Emily's sisters remember her as a diligent reader, always searching for knowledge. They also remember that she left home at an early age to seek employment, finally taking up dressmaking as a trade. So I think I'll just move on from there. That's basically about Emily. She was adventurous, she left home early, and she travelled throughout a number of different states, throughout Victoria itself, Tasmania, Queensland, and New South Wales. There's not a lot that we can find out about that particular period, except what her siblings have said. Muriel Handley writes, this is when Emily first heard of the faith. It's quite an interesting story. It was during 1921 in Sydney that Emily overheard some people talking about some article which had appeared about the Baha'i faith. The conversation made little impression upon Emily, but one name that they had spoken remained very clearly in her memory, and that name, of course, was Abdul Baha. At least 3 articles referred to Abdul Baha that year. One was a report in the Hebrew Journal about a recently translated tablet on Israel that Sir Abdul Baha Abbas presented to the High Commissioner. Another reported that women in Persia were being freed from bondage and prejudice by Abdul Baha's teaching on the equality of women and men. And a large feature article about Abdul Baha was published in a Sydney journal, The World News, in October under the title Sacrificing Their Riches, Extraordinary Story of a New Movement. We can't be sure which of these prompted the conversation overheard by Emily that she recalled. This is something from Trove, where all the old newspapers have been digitised, National Library of Australia. So this is from that particular article, that it might have been that one that the people were talking about. And of course, this beautiful photo of Abdul Bahais. So Abdul Bahais' name stuck in Emily's mind. One of the things that Muriel Handley knew about Emily was that she was a dressmaker, and she would have done needlework at school. In fact, we know that because we've got some of her school records. But I found this in one of the early newspapers from 1924, and it's the East Sydney Technical College at Darlinghurst, and it was and Emily Miller is mentioned there as having done all these various dressmaking things. And although there's lots of Emily Millers, when you're researching online in different states, etc., there's lots of Emily Millers. There was usually, you can tell, you know, if they've got partners or extended family and things like that. But in this case, it wasn't any other family around there with a similar sort of occupation. So I believe this is probably Emily. These are some of the things that occurred. Emily went along with Margaret Dixson to lectures on astrology and numerology by Arthur Wilby in Sydney, and these are from 1925. Also, we have there, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Hyde Dunn advertising the meetings at Randwick. During the period after the First World War, in addition to the mainstream Christian churches, and in that particular issue of the paper, there were 79 mainstream religions advertised. Like Jane was saying, there were so many different organisations and movements offering spiritual and quasi-spiritual solutions to the human condition. So, and there's some of them down the bottom there. So there was a lot to pick from, but Emily focused on the faith. And Hyde and Clara Dunn, and so she went along there and met and actually met Mother Dunn, and for the rest of her life, and she lived a very long time. She lived until she was 91, and passed away in 1981. So, and she was a steadfast Baha'i right through. This is the earliest photo we had, and it caused some perplexity, and been talking to Graham about this, but there was names in handwriting on the back of this photo. It was very, very hard to, you know, to work out exactly who was who. But I haven't got a cursor here to show you, but Margaret Dixson is at the back on the left-hand side, and then Oswald Whittaker, and we believe that was Emily next to them. Although she looks quite old there, she was only actually about 36 or 37 at that stage, but there'd been hard times. She'd had a hard life on the farm and milking the cows and things like that. And then and she basically lived in poverty. And then of course the First World War and the Spanish influenza epidemic, all those sorts of things that happened. So perhaps poverty had aged her quickly. And the others, we believe on the left, a contact, because that was written on the back of the photo, and then Mother Dunn and Father Dunn, and perhaps Linda Whittaker standing behind Father Dunn, and the Whittaker child on his knee. That's what we're thinking at this stage. This is another piece of information which shows that there was a Miss Emily Miller at 69 Cascade Street, Paddington, at that stage. So again, it's possibly our Emily. Emily became a Baha'i in 1926, very early, and but it wasn't until the 1930s that the National Assembly established a register of, I think that's correct, of the Baha'is. So this is Emily's declaration card in 1930, retrospective to 1926, and number 56 in the register. I don't think it goes in chronological order from the date of the declarations. I'm not sure about that, but I don't think so. Eventually, the Miller family moved from Gippsland to Melbourne, and this is one of their residences in Melbourne. This is actually the second residence in Melbourne. Some Baha'i activities were held there, some Baha'i firesides at one stage. And this is the earlier residence at 21 Montague Street, Moonee Ponds. And this is a letter from Mother Dunn, because there were difficult times. There was only a few Baha'is at that stage, around 92, in 1932. And this was in 1932, I believe there was, Graham could correct me here, but I think there was only about 70 Baha'is in Australia. And there was difficulties in Melbourne with people, some of the Baha'is not understanding, not being willing to follow some of the directions from the Guardian. And but Emily and Margaret Dixson were very, very steadfast and strong in the covenant. And this obviously is a letter from Mother Dunn answering some of Emily's queries and perhaps giving her confidence. I think it's a remarkable letter. It's a long letter, and it tells you so much about Emily. There's so much there that about the history of the time, and also it sort of this part here. There's the part in the middle. Perhaps I could read that. Don't let your heart be too troubled about Melbourne either. Keith or another teacher will come soon, I feel sure. They raised £10 in Sydney towards a ticket for her to return after she has been to Haifa instead of returning to America. She is indeed a most wonderful teacher, and how I thank God for her and feel he was so good in sending her to us. I'm glad you received so much from her. I feel sure there is no finer teacher in all the Baha'i cause, no one better fitted, and all her life seems to have been a preparation for what she is doing now. Actually, that's not the piece that I wanted to read. Oh, there it is here. I know Melbourne did what they could and made a superhuman effort, but next time they must have help from outside and we will have the same good result. I'm sending Margaret Dixon's letter for you to send on, as I will not know where to send it. Just keep on, dear heart, and be firm and steadfast in his glorious cause. It needs the ones with the strong backs that nothing or no one can swerve. I think that's the keynote that Emily took from Mother Dunn, and that's the way she was. This is the photo that Jane showed before, and Emily is standing behind Father Dunn, fourth in the middle row, fourth from the right. It's a marvellous photo. So she looks younger there than in the first photo. So perhaps things had picked up for her. This is Cyril and Emily. She became Mrs. Easy, and an entry in the register of Australian believers in the National Archives knows they married in 1944. And Cyril declared in 1947. After 1923, in the 1920s, there hadn't been no assembly in Melbourne, and this so there was a lot of work during the 1940s, and this was the first assembly that was established after all that. So you can see Emily is in the back row, second from the right, and Cyril is first on the left in the back row. National Baha'i Convention at Paddington, Sydney in 1950, and Emily and Cyril are third and fourth from the left at the back. There's many there that everyone will know. I think it's a wonderful photo with Madge Featherston and Effie Baker laughing there. I'm not sure what's happened there. The green, or somebody.
That's me. I was drawing around, but now I've got to learn how to. Now I've got to learn how to get rid of them.
So 1953 National Convention. So Emily and Cyril, and prior to that, Emily tried to get along to all the Baha'i activities, summer schools and conventions, etc.
I see Effie Baker there.
Sorry. Yes, that's Emily on the right, and over on the left, third from in the middle row, third from the left is Cyril. Another one of that convention. The hand of the cross on the second from the right, from the side there. This was a poem that Emily wrote. I recall it. She told me about a vision, a sort of vision. She'd been unwell, and a vision she had of Abdul Baha. And I thought years later, did I dream that or not? But then, but I can recall that at her little cottage, widow's cottage in South Geelong, her saying that to me. And I asked some of the other Baha'is, and they weren't sure. But then this turned up a poem by Emily about such a thing. And I won't read it through, but it's there for anyone who would like to see it in the future. But it's a high quality poem to it, really full of feeling and genuine. This is quite an iconic photo. This is getting into the 1950s now in Melbourne. And it was taken at 25 Rosstown Road, Carnegie. The Handley family came across from Hobart and in 1950, and that boosted the numbers quite considerably. One of the things was that a lot of the early strong Baha'is were single women and living quite often in poverty. But the Handleys, when they came as a family, and there was one of the first families to give such a boost. It created a different atmosphere, I think. John Handley's online tonight. He might like to speak to this because it's a very important occasion that concerning Hand of the Cause, who just come back from Haifa. Is John there?
Yes, yes, I am. But can you hear me?
Yes, yes, John.
Yes, yes. Look, that was taken in November of 1957. That was the total Victorian Baha'i community -1. There was a lady that lived in Talgarno in northern Victoria near Albury, and I completely forget her name, but she was the only Baha'i in Victoria that was missing from this gathering. And this was when Collis came back from the conclave in Haifa, and he desired to meet all the Baha'is in all the capital cities in Australia and explain the situation about there being no guardian, and that the hands were the chief stewards of the faith, and that the House of Justice would be elected in 1963. And this was the photo in Melbourne.
Thank you very much, John. This is another photo, actually. John's in this one on the left-hand side there, and that's at the back of Rosstown Road in Carnegie, around the same era, 1950s. Muriel in the middle. And this is a few years ago, I took some photos. This is 25 Rosstown Road. I'm not sure if it's still there today. This was about 2014, I think.
Yes, Terry, the last time I was in Melbourne, which was probably after that, the house was still there.
It would be nice if it was all done up one day, wouldn't it? And let me be sorry, something's happened here. Okay, one. I seem to have missed a slide there somehow.
The one I can tell you about that one too.
I'll just go back. Yes, okay, John, please.
Yes, this was taken at 35 Devoy Street in Oakley, and this was the day Collis Featherstone is there on the left, and it was the day that both my sister Jean and her husband Bill Johnson, and also Betty Jackson, who is in the photo, they all declared as Baha'is on that day. I say Jean declared, it was really a redeclaration because, of course, she was a Baha'i back in Tasmania, but it was sort of a new declaration with her husband.
Thanks, John. And this is 35 Devoy Street. There was a lot of Baha'i activity there, apparently, and so many visits from various Baha'is, and it's that again was about 2014, but it looks $1 million. It's probably would cost that much too. Wonderful, wonderful to see that. This is where Cyril and Emily Easy lived in St Kilda. And 24 Empress Road, and there was Regional Teaching Committee of Victoria used to quite often meet there. And Cyril lived there during the week after they pioneered to Geelong, because he worked for Kodak in Melbourne, so he stayed up there. This is John's father, Everett Handley, and in Collis Featherstone at Rosstown Road. Pioneering to Geelong in 1953, at the beginning of the 10-year World Crusade in 1953, Emily and Cyril Easy pioneered to Geelong to fulfill one of the goals. Cyril worked as a printer for Kodak in Melbourne during the week, and they held teaching activities in Geelong each weekend. I put these in because to show that all the friends were in contact with each other. It was like one large national family, and these were in Emily's effects after she passed away, and there are a set of beautiful hand-coloured photographs, hand-coloured by Effie Baker, and each one signed. So these are only some of them, which are in our archives now. Signed on the front and with the botanical names written on the back too. So they're photographs and they've been coloured by hand. It's a very hard technique to actually master, but Effie's done it superlatively there. This is the cottage on the left-hand side where Emily lived most of the years in Geelong. It was only a one-room cottage. It had no hot water, no inside toilet outside, and very, very basic. But it was what was provided for widows who were fortunate enough to be able to apply for that. And we have letters concerning Emily's application, and that's where we used to go, and where a lot of the young people in Geelong used to go to Emily's place, and she would talk, and she would deepen them on the teachings in that little cottage. These are letters or samples of letters, that we have in the archives from the National Assembly, from the National Archives. One from Doris Whiting offering her accommodation for the temple dedication, and she went to that. The one on the right is from Frank Saunders in Alice Springs, pioneered there in 1956. And so I'll just read that. It is very colourful here, an oasis in the desert. There are large Aboriginal populations. One day hope to be able to approach them, but it is not easy, what with the native affairs people and the missions. Still a way will be made open, I am sure. Have quite a lot of letters from the friends and have got to get over my antipathy for writing letters. Perhaps with more practice, my letters may become better. With Baha'i love, Frank Saunders. There were so many letters backwards and forwards all the time, amongst all the Baha'is. I should say, by the way, that envelope actually is a caricature which wouldn't be acceptable nowadays. But it sort of indicates this sort of institutional racism that we didn't know existed, or people didn't recognise in those days, but it was there beneath everything. So, yeah, it's. I'm glad that that era has passed. The friends in those days, they didn't have lots of books. They depended on circulating prayers written out by hand, etc. And they would be passed from one to another, and copies made. So this is in Emily's handwriting. And Reg Priestley, another one of the Geelong Bahais, he sent this to us, and he says the handwritten prayer is important, written by Emily Easy. This was the way in which new translated material was circulated before the faith really got the book business together. material would come from the World Centre or some other authoritative source and would be hand copied and distributed to the friends. Em, Reg used to call her Em endearingly, gave this one to me in the very early 60s and is an excerpt from the tablets of Abdul Baha. A letter from Doris Whiting. I think we might have seen that one before. John will be able to talk about this. This is a very interesting thing. One of the 1950s sort of set a lot of precedents, and with in terms of the governments and things like this. This is one of the precedents that was set in 1959 when John was called up. Would you like to talk about this, John?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much, Terry. And thank you for the information about Emily Easy. I knew Emily very well from the time I moved to Victoria in 1950, right up until I left Victoria in 1961. But yes, in the 1950s, there was national service, and everybody, all the men were called up to serve 3 months national service training. And then they had a selective call-up system, and they picked birth dates out of a hat. And I was fortunate or unfortunate to have been called up for national service in July of 1958 when I turned 18. And because I was a Baha'i, I applied for non-combatant duty. And subsequently in 1959, I was asked to go to the Ballarat Court of Petty Sessions, and if you like, plead my case about wanting to become a non-combatant in the national service. And this letter was a letter that I took to the court that was written by Noel Walker, who was then Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly. And it's a very wonderful letter and set forth all the ideals of the faith. And in the court, I produced this letter to the judge that was, or the magistrate, I guess, that was presiding the hearing. I'm not sure whether it was a case or a hearing. I don't know whether Graham Nicholson is online tonight, but when I went to this court hearing, I was put in the witness stand to, if you like, state my case. And I always wondered throughout life why I was put in the witness stand, why I wasn't an accused in the court. And only a few years ago, I was talking to Graham Nicholson about this, and he said that I was not on trial. I was a witness to the trial or the case, and it was actually the Baha'i faith and its teachings that were being tested. So that's an interesting thing, and Graham, no doubt, would be able to tell more about the, I guess, the legal system and the legalities of that. Subsequently, I went to Puckapunyal in Victoria as a trainee in the national service in September. Yes, it was September 1959, and it was an interesting experience. And it is one that shows that you never know where your teachings of the faith come from or what the effects are. I went into army camp. I was a non-combatant, and I was drafted into a infantry battalion of all things. And I hadn't been there more than about half an hour, and I was called up and taken to the commanding officer of the company, and stood outside his office and was given all the directions of what are the right things and wrong things to do in front of the commanding officer, and the staff sergeant that had taken me up there says, "I don't know what you've done to be called up here to the commanding officer." I was duly taken into his office and stood in front of his desk, and he said, "You, Private Handley, you're a Baha'i, are you?" And I could have fallen over backwards, and I said, "Yes, sir, I'm a Baha'i." And this man, he got up, he came around his desk and he shook my hand and he said, "Please come and talk to me and tell me about the Baha'i faith, or more about the Baha'i faith in Australia." He was a US Army person. He had served in the Pacific during the Second World War, and he had heard of the Baha'i faith from Baha'is that had served in the Pacific, again as non-combatants during the war. This would have been American Baha'is, of course. He had attended meetings in the foundation hall of the temple in Chicago, and he was well versed in the teachings of Baha'u'llah. To go on from there, I was sent to the regimental aid post about 2 weeks after I was in camp, because I had to march up and down the parade ground for a couple of weeks. And in the RAP, or regimental aid post, I was welcomed in there by a sergeant. And you know, I only remembered yesterday his name, and he was Sergeant Bill Anderson. And he was a wonderful person. And when I went in there, he whispered me, he said, "Oh, you're a Jehovah's Witness, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm a Baha'i." And there was no comment at all. And that was very unusual in the 1950s, because not many people in Australia had heard of the Baha'i faith. But to cut a long story short, he had heard, and I only found this out after I had left the army camp and went back to Ballarat, that he had sat up all night with my brother-in-law, Bill Johnson, on a train from Sydney to Albury, and Bill had told him about the Baha'i faith. So he was well versed in the Baha'i faith as well. So that was quite an amazing situation to hear, or to be serving in an infantry battalion in the army, and have the commanding officer and my officer that I was directly responsible to, having both been well versed in the faith. And as a result of this, I was able to daily talk to people about the faith during the army camp. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you very much, John. They're wonderful things to hear, and to be more widely known like that. Thank you very much. Some of these people I'm not sure of, but perhaps others will know. This is Stella Charles and I think Harry Carter, and possibly in Ballarat. So if anyone can help with any of these names later, that would be wonderful. This is a teaching trip to Framingham from Ballarat, from the Ballarat community, and that's Jean Johnson there with the other friends. And this is the Ballarat Assembly. I haven't got an exact date for that, but someone might know exactly. John knows this very well.
Oh, this was
Yeah.
long after. This is long after I had left
Oh yes,
Ballarat.
yes, yeah.
The interesting person there is the person on the right that I'd talked to you about a couple of weeks ago, Keith Brown.
Keith Brown, yes.
And he was probably one of the first contacts that my mother and I had when we moved to Ballarat. And there's quite a story about him as well.
We might just move on and perhaps come back to that though later on when we have some any questions and some more chance. This is
Just could we just go back to that other one?
yes.
In the middle of that photograph is Claire Pound. Can I just mention Claire Pound?
Yes, please.
Claire Pound and her husband, I forget his first name. I only ever know him as Dr. Pound. He was a lecturer at the School of Mines in Ballarat. And Claire was a contact from the time that Elizabeth Heinsohn, who was then Betty Bunny, and Vi Hernker spent in Ballarat in 1953. And when Mum and I moved to Ballarat in the end of 1957, Claire was our contact, and she often used to come to the house to our Monday night firesides, and we would often go and visit them. But she was the first Baha'i in Ballarat.
Wonderful, thanks, John. This is another one from actually your daughter got this one taken off a slide, I think. Is that right?
Yes, this was taken off a slide, and this is Bill Smits and Michitoshi Zenamoto. And Bill Smits was a pioneer in Korea at the time, and I think this was in 1958, the first year we were in Ballarat. And Michitoshi was the first Japanese Baha'i to come to Australia after the Second World War. And I mean, this is 13 years after the end of the Second World War. And while he was in Australia, the Baha'is were fearful of his safety, as he wrote to me in a letter that a communication I had with him, I guess about 15 years ago was the last time we communicated. But yes, he was a wonderful Baha'i. Incidentally, Michitoshi was a survivor of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima.
Could I just quickly go through? I might just put them up and not. So I just wanted to get to the end of it because I wanted to mention someone there who was important. I'll leave it there just for a second. Good to have these on file. So this was a Victorian State teaching conference at Everett Handley's place in Chadstone. So the house is still there. And it's fascinating reading. I think it was Muriel Handley was the secretary. This is another example of homemade sort of passing around the writings and teachings, and people made their own books, and this is from Muriel Handley, John's mother. The first local spiritual assembly of Melbourne, of the city of Melbourne, as opposed to in the 1950s, there was an assembly, but it was composed of people from different municipalities. And that after 1957, that was disbanded. So this is the first one from the municipality of the city of Melbourne itself. There's two versions of that, and this one's I've only got a photocopy of it, not the original. But if anybody has the original, it'd be good to perhaps share it. Victorian Teaching Conference. It's a fascinating photo, this one. There's some gaps there too. Some of these photos, perhaps in a future session, we could put up and have a discussion about, or if anybody can fill in any of the gaps there, please let us know. I wanted to mention Stella Childs. With Margaret Dixson and Muriel Handley, Emily Easy. Stella Childs is another wonderful early Baha'i who has had enormous impact on many, many people. And she's, to me, the quintessential Baha'i teacher because she, every moment, she seemed to be teaching. Wherever she went, whoever she met, she'd be mentioning the faith and encouraging people to investigate. So I just wanted to end off with...
Excuse me, Terry.
Yes.
It's Helen Perkins here. Fantastic presentation. May I just interrupt you for a second, tell you, I found out doing my family history that Stella Childs and I are related.
Oh. I'm not surprised.
We have the same great-great-grandfather.
That's wonderful.
There you are. I'll let you go. Sorry.
Thank you, Helen. So this is Stella. She purchased, when she came across to Victoria, she was in Ballarat and Bendigo, and then she went to Denali and purchased Effie Baker's house. And that's when I knew her. And that's a photo I took up there. I went up a few times with Rosalie and Les Andre. And this is what I want to end with. It's called The Pioneer, and it's only excerpts from this poem, and it's by Roger White, who I think he's a wonderful poet. And it's if I could indulge myself a little bit and just read this for you. The Pioneer. You will meet her anywhere, the river, market, roadside, bus, in Carcross, Nairobi, Liverpool, Duluth, and the old girl will be smiling. She knows. Do not accept the invitation to her home to meet her friend from Adelaide, Tehran, Kaduna. They are conspirators and drink from the same well. Her own certitude is baked into the cakes she serves with tea, tasting of her own contentment that leaves you crazed, thirsting forever for assurance. Be warned, she is dangerous. The moment is selected. You will not see all heaven's angels, all ancient good, the very weight of history rush to her support as she gathers breath. Her smile never more gentle. Have you heard the message of Baha'u'llah? Nor will you know that God himself throughout all worlds gives ear to your reply. I tell you, she is dangerous. Roger White. Thanks, Graham.
Terry, thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. Everybody online has learned from you tonight and been inspired by your presentation of these wonderful souls, beginning with Emily Miller, who became Emily Easy, and moving all the way through the Handley family, Muriel Handley, and John, who's online with us tonight, and coming up to Stella Childs. There's very many more people who could be mentioned. I was hoping that you would also tell a little bit about your own story and how you, your friendship with Emily Easy. You haven't spoken much about that tonight. I wonder whether you wanted to spend a few minutes explaining your friendship with her and the impact that it had on your life, if you would mind.
Yes, thanks, Graham. Yes, Warren Hastings, she was one of the first Baha'is that Warren took me to meet, and I was immediately impressed. She had this gravitas. She very rarely smiled. You could just sometimes see a glimmer of smile there, but she very rarely smiled. She's a very serious person, but you could feel the love underneath all that exterior. And I remember one of the things that really struck me about her was it was not long after we became Baha'is, a few months, and it was midsummer, and one weekend, and about 35 degrees in the shade, and there was a knock on the door in the afternoon, and it was Emily Easy. She lived about 4 kilometres away. From her little cottage up to our house was nearly 4 kilometres, and it was all uphill all the way. She was 83 years old, and she brought us afternoon tea. Kim and I, we had 2 little children at that stage, but she'd walked all that way in the heat with cakes for us for afternoon tea. It sort of is a very moving experience to see someone, and it was out of the goodness of her heart. She wanted us to know about true Baha'i hospitality. So that was one of the really significant things about Emily that I always remember. There were many others, but on the spot now I can't think. I remember becoming a Baha'i was, I went to the Geelong Teachers College, and as a mature age student, and all the students were adolescents basically, straight out of high school, and but Warren Hastings was there, and he was in his 3rd year of a diploma of teaching, and he'd won a scholarship from the Commonwealth to teach Aboriginal children in the Northern Territory, and he was in his 3rd year, and he had that same gravitas too. So he had his fiancée Elizabeth, where she was Malaysian Chinese, and my wife Kim was Vietnamese, so we had some sort of an affinity there. And one day he said to me, and it was sort of late in the year, I've got something very important to tell you. And I thought, I thought it might be Amway, because Amway had started up around that time and was going full pelt.
Terry, I've done that so that we can see you. Keep going.
Sorry, yeah. I mentioned it to Kim, and Kim said invite him for dinner one night. So Warren came to our place for dinner one night, and we had a nice meal. And Kim, as she often does, after the meal was finished, she'd retire and just leave us talking there. So after a while, I said to Warren, what was it that you wanted to tell me that was so important? And in the conversation there, what struck me was he said, Christ has returned. And I was dumbfounded by that. And it was the strangest thing, because during the Vietnam War and all the bloodshed and trauma, of it. The one thing that, because I'd always believed in God and I hadn't lost my belief in God, but I always wondered why Christ, who had promised to return, had not kept that promise, and as a result, the world was in such disorder and disarray. And so I of course, I had many questions. I wanted to know on what basis that he could say such a thing, that Christ had returned. So this went on for a couple of hours into the early hours of the morning, and he told me all about Baha'u'llah. I can't see you, Graham, so I'm not sure what's going on.
Sorry, well, thank you. We've been listening to your story, so everybody can see you and has been listening to that. Thank you so much for sharing that at the end of your presentation. That brings the formal part of the presentation for this evening to an end, and I want to thank everybody for participating.